I'm a sexton in Swamp City. For those who don't know, a sexton is essentially a caretaker for a graveyard. Way back in the olden days, back when the church would own most of the public services, including graveyards, they would hire someone to take care of the land. That person was known as the sexton. I know in the modern day some people prefer the term groundskeeper or caretaker, but in my family it was always just known as the sexton, and I don't mind. I think it makes me sound a little cooler than just the caretaker, because caretaker makes it sound like I'm just the gardener of the graveyard. But honestly, I'm in charge of a whole lot more than that. We sell the plots of land, we maintain the gravestones, we take care of it, we keep people out when they try to do some spooky stuff on Halloween, and most importantly, I help people find closure. I help arrange the funerals. I help people when they feel like they need to move on with their life after their family's death. So, what makes my job unique in Swamp City is we're the only public graveyard in all of Swamp City. Swamp City, as you can probably guess, was built on a swamp. So, with the ground table, the water table, being as so high, there was practically nowhere to really dig. Things had to be built up, and sadly, if you're trying to bury things, building up isn't really an option. But luckily, one of my ancestors managed to come across one of the few plots of land in all of the swamp that was dry. So he bought it all up and then began burying things here, and then began charging people for him to bury things there. And so the family business had taken off from there. I know, it sounds morbid being the owner of a graveyard, but I actually find it pretty peaceful. I get to stay away from the chaos of the inner Swamp City, and being the only public graveyard essentially made me immune to most of the politics that makes Swamp City such a chaotic place. Unfortunately, though, there are a few drawbacks. Being the only public graveyard in Swamp City meant that I am pretty much guaranteed to get any deaths in here. Someone can't pay, drop them off at my graveyard. We don't even know who that is, drop them off at my graveyard. Mysterious skeleton suddenly appears in the middle of Swamp City with a police officer's bullet through the skull hole and an ID matching someone missing 30 years ago. Dump them in my graveyard and I'll take care of it. But even with all those downsides, I didn't mind it too much. Before my dad passed away about 5 years ago, I got to even explore the world. Once I graduated college, accounting major, if you can believe it or not, because that comes in handy in a graveyard, I got to explore. I got to see each of the 7 cities, even made it to the Northern Forest, and all the way to the Kingdom of Dawn. It was nice. I enjoyed backpacking, made friends all over the world, and when my dad passed away, I came home, buried him in the graveyard he kept his entire life. And then the family business fell to me. And now, here I am managing it. It's been a peaceful 5 years, with the exception of clearing up a few skeletons the police wanted gone, and a few more skeletons the criminals wanted gone. But overall I enjoyed it, and I made enough. One day though, I came across something that was weird enough, I felt that I had to post it online. So, even though it's been over 5 years since my dad died, I still visit his grave often. He's in a secluded little section of the graveyard, between 3 different trees. Supposedly these trees were built by 3 of my different ancestors, and over my dad's grave was a little sapling. Well, I guess it's a little more than a sapling by now, because we buried it as soon as my dad died, but in time, it'll grow up as big as the other trees here. And someday, I'll be buried here, with another tree growing over my body. On my way to this secluded section, though, I have to go through the old graveyard. So, the old graveyard of Swamp City is from very, very long ago, back when Swamp City was barely even a town. And back then, when people made gravestones, they made these gravestones. I'm talking the big, old, faded, heavy things that people love to take pictures of, that the tourists who love to visit love to see, who try to decipher what it says because it's too hard to see what's carved in. Yeah, that's what the old graves are like. But passing through the old graves, I noticed that one of them, an unmarked one, of course, had the dirt disturbed. Getting close to it, trying to see if maybe I had gophers or something. Yeah, I know it's weird, but like in the graveyard, gophers and rabbits are big problems. But getting close, I saw that the dirt pile was too big for gophers. It looked like it disturbed the entire grave line. So, looking close to it, figuring maybe I had another grave robber issue, I realized the grave next to it was dug up too. And the one next to that, and the one next to that, and the one next to that too. In fact, in the entire old graveyard, it looked like a lot of graves had been dug up recently. So, realizing this was probably a much bigger issue than a single grave robber or pranker, I decided to call the Swamp City Police Department. Calling them from my cell phone, the dispatcher sounded bored when I called them in. Swamp City PD, where we serve with a smile. How can I help you today? Hi, yes, I'm the sexton of the Swamp City Graveyard. I noticed that a lot of the old graves are being disturbed. I think there might be a grave robber or something here. Can you mind sending a couple police officers to investigate? Okay. How much are you charging for this? What? How much are you giving the officers to come out to your graveyard? Nothing. I figured it's your job. Swamp City PD doesn't leave the station for less than 500 centi. So tell me, how much are you going to give for this? You know what? I'll figure it out myself. Thank you, officer, I said angrily before I hung up. I knew Swamp City's police was not very good and known throughout the 7 cities for being pretty corrupt. But I figured they would at least have the common courtesy to at least try to investigate before asking for a bribe. Seriously, what is the world coming to? Seriously, back in my day, we did our work before we asked for bribes. So, I figured it would just be easier to do the investigation myself. So, that day, I got a camcorder. I took a nap during the day, and I came out as the sun was setting. And I just kind of camped out in a lawn chair. Even though there were a lot of graves dug up at the old graveyard, there were still quite a few more that weren't dug up. So, I waited throughout the night. I figured whoever or whatever was digging up the graves would come tonight too, and then I could catch them in the act. And from there, I could figure out what's going on. What happened, though, was not something I quite expected. So, from where the swamp began to meet the graveyard, I could hear something splashing about. Now, waking up from my half sleeping stupor, I brought my camera out and hit record while I heard the splashing get closer and closer. Something crawled out of the water and crawled through the dark of the night. Whatever it was, I could tell it was big from the way it was making its noises, and it almost sounded like it was stomping. When it finally came out into the moonlight, my heart nearly stopped when I saw it. Have you ever seen an old statue of the Egyptian god Sobek? Or if not a statue, maybe a picture or a painting? This creature reminded me a lot of that. Only much, much more terrifying. It was kind of humanoid in the way that like it stood on its hind legs and it had 2 long arms. But past that, it wasn't human. Its skin was kind of a gray-green. Looked a lot like some of the gators that we get out in the swamp who sometimes wander into the graveyard. But it stood a lot taller than any gator I had seen long. It must have been at least 10 feet tall from the bottom of its feet to the top of its head. And the tail it dragged behind it was even longer than it was tall. In its large, strong arms, I could see claws at the end of each finger, and even a shovel. It was dragging along the largest shovel I had ever seen in my life as it made its way through the old graveyard. And its head, oh Lord, its head. It looked like an alligator's head if an alligator had crawled out of hell itself. Its eyes glowed. They legitimately were glowing in the dark. The color was like a radioactive green. It glowed brightly in the night, and it felt almost dangerous to look at. And its teeth jutted from its mouth, even with its snout closed. And even though it had no hair, it had like 4 feet of swamp moss just dangling from the top of its head down, giving it an unnatural look, with it being a crocodile with hair. As it dragged its muddy shovel to a grave that had not been disturbed yet, it then quickly got to work, putting the shovel into the ground and pulling out dirt. It moved a lot quicker than anything of its size should ever move, and it didn't just disturb the grave. Within minutes, the entire grave was dug up, and it made its way down to the coffin. And even though I couldn't see it very well from my angle, I could hear the way it cracked open the lid of the coffin. Then I heard its squishing noise as it reached in and dragged its contents out, dumping it onto the ground above. Once then, it crawled its way out and slithered along the ground. When it was on all fours close to the body, it looked almost like a normal alligator, except alligators don't normally get as large as it did. And its eyes, there was something too intelligent behind those eyes. This thing wasn't just a normal animal. It looked like it knew what it was doing, and it wanted to do more. I expected it to start eating the corpse or maybe drag it away or something. Instead, what it did was it slowly opened its jaws. And from inside the Sobek's jaws, I could see many, many more of its little creatures dragging itself out of its mouth as they began to feast upon the corpse. I couldn't count how many there were in the dark, but there was at least a dozen of its babies. These creatures looked like baby gators, just as adorable, but their eyes were also intelligent like its mother's, and their movements were way too fast, especially for a creature moving in the night. As all the babies crawled out of its mouth, I could see steam rising from Sobek's mouth as it closed it. Whatever this creature was, it was warm-blooded. And its babies, I'll spare you the details of what it did. I recorded what it did, and I nearly throw up every time I see it. But needless to say, those creatures cleaned off the bones of a corpse that had been buried for over a century. I remember seeing one of them crawl into the corpse's mouth and emerging from an eye socket less than a moment later, chewing on something. But whatever it was, I doubt it was pleasant. And while these creatures fed, its mother stood watch. In less than an hour, the corpse had been picked to the bone, and then the babies left the skeleton. Now, not sure what they were going to do. Was the Sobek going to knock it into the grave? Was it going to drag it away? Instead, it began to crunch the skeleton's bones. It started with the femur, the longest and presumably the crunchiest, but then it just stuck it in the jaw and began snapping it like it was gum or something. The sound at night, after that night, I can never chew gum again because the snapping noise in my mouth reminds me too much of the way it chewed on those bones. It chewed those bones and ground them up before swallowing what was left. When it had cleared just about everything out and it made its way to the skull, its eyes made contact with mine. Until this moment, I don't think I was worthy of the Sobek's attention, but it saw the camera and it saw me, and I could see behind its eyes it was deciding what it was going to do with me. As my breath caught, instead of chewing on the skull, the Sobek stood back on its hind legs again and picked up the skull, leaving it on top of the gravestone. A reminder, just for me, about what this creature could do. Once that had been done, the creature crawled again on all fours and took its children back into its mouth. With all its babies safely tucked away, it closed its mouth and began to shovel the dirt back into the grave. It took a lot less time shoveling dirt in than it did shoveling dirt out, but still, it was very quick. And once it was done, the Sobek dragged itself back into the swamp, carrying its shovel with it. When I heard the splashing get further and further away, I didn't breathe easy until after I could no longer hear it. Even then, I waited half an hour there just to hear if it would come back again. That night, all the calls of the birds and the splashing of the fish terrified me, because I felt like it was going to disguise what the Sobek was going to do. But it didn't return that night, so I went back to my home. And with this new footage, I wasn't sure what to do. I watched it over once before I deleted it. Watching those things tear into the corpse a second time, I didn't want there to be a third. Not for me or for anyone else. So, with that video deleted, I decided to post online to see if I can get help somewhere. Swamp City Police Department's gonna be zero help whatsoever, and in Swamp City there aren't enough heroes to call upon, let alone one that can handle whatever the hell this creature is. Like, honestly, I'm not connected enough to ask for a villain's help, so here I am, going out online to ask for the internet's help, because I'm not sure what to do. But the worst part, at least in my opinion, is I still have nightmares from that night. In those dreams, I am haunted by eyes. Sometimes it's those dozens of red little eyes just looking at me and just scampering off when I get too close. Sometimes it's those big, green radioactive eyes hovering over me while the Sobek opened her mouth and was ready to strike at me. But the very worst nights are the nights where it's the empty sockets of that skull. In those eyes, I can feel judgment. I can feel years worth of judgment behind that. There was a person's life behind what those eyes were. There was a person's family, a person's history, everything that made up a person, and it was just food to the scavenger's babies. And the worst part of looking into those empty sockets is I could still recognize the person who was supposed to be behind those eyes. But I guess that makes sense. It's not every day you see an alligator creature dig up your father's grave.